Thank you, Nicole, for that wonderful introduction. I must say, first of all, what a huge privilege it is to be here. I feel like a terrible interloper amongst so many eminent Brahmsians, I have to say. And thank you to the organising committee and to the American Brahms Society for inviting me. It's a delight to be here. Okay, so my original plan for this talk involved a huge pile of data which encompassed Brahmsian first themes, Brahmsian second themes, and an analysis of the first movement of the double concerto. And I realised sometime before Christmas that would probably kill me and my audience eventually. So I didn't do that. Nevertheless, the project I'm reporting on here is, I think, still overambitious. In order to kind of tame it a little bit, you have two handouts. I've imaginatively called them 1 and 2. One of them is tables and another examples. If you have more imaginative titles for those, I'm happy to hear them. My talk has 5 parts, which should be clearly flagged, and I hope I come in within the hour. I've tried very hard to make sure that this is all not out of control in that respect. So, I begin by recalling a conversation I had at a conference in 2012 with a leading analyst of Brahms's music. As some of you may know, I've spent much of my career writing about Bruckner, but I let it slip in this conversation that I was attempting to write a book about Brahms. "Ah," he said, "you've come over from the dark side." Actually, he didn't use quite that level of faux theatricality, but you get the idea. You'll be pleased to see that I've refrained from dressing as Darth Vader for this occasion, at least. I can't promise not to do that in general, but today I'm not doing that. And as far as I know, no planet-destroying Brucknerian space station has its guns trained on us as I speak. This anecdote does, however, provoke reflection on my own academic identity, if you'll forgive a moment of self-scrutiny. I should say immediately that, honoured as I am to be here, I wouldn't presume to call myself a Brahms scholar, especially in such august company, or for that matter, a Bruckner scholar, but rather an analyst with a consuming interest in Brahms and Bruckner. The thoughts I offer today come from this disciplinary perspective. My aim is to report on a Brahmsian theoretical project, but also to consider its broader implications for analytical practice and in various ways to take stock of the place of analysis in the current musicological academy. I begin with the Brahms-Bruckner antithesis because it affords a useful starting point on the grounds that it has served, I'll try that again, since both composers' lifetimes as a nexus of cultural, analytical and aesthetic antagonisms, and this, it seems to me, sets up rather well some of the debates I'm going to try and grasp. As anyone who has crossed this divide will attest, the analytical playing field that Brahms and Bruckner inhabit is not level, but in fact significantly tilted in Brahms's favour. Brahms's music and our scholarly analytical culture are so enmeshed that they are almost impossible to disentangle, whereas, despite his best efforts, Bruckner found himself an outsider compositionally, culturally and socially, and this characterisation has conditioned analytical perceptions up to the present. Brahms allegedly composed organically within the classic romantic tradition, which practice remains foundational for theories with which we analyse his music. Bruckner, allegedly, filled classical models with post-Wagnerian harmonic, gestural and stylistic unorthodoxies, which a century of reception has struggled to explain. Brahms inhabits our analytical traditions comfortably because their lineage includes Brahms, an inheritance that Bruckner has, for the most part, shaped as a constitutive other rather than a fellow traveller. And this brings me to my title of part 1, Brahms amongst the analysts. So I want to give some reflections now on the relationship between Brahms and analysis more generally. Brahms's music analytical complicity has recently been considered by Scott Murphy, who reasons that what Murphy calls, quote, the abstract consanguinity between Brahms and today's music analyst, end quote, arises because modern analytical thought reflects Brahms's compositional thought. This leads Murphy to extend the list of accolades that Brahms has accrued. And I quote, "Brahms has earned enough honorifics over the years, the classicist, the progressive, the ambivalent, the subversive, and so on, that one more would do no harm, Brahms the analyst." By these terms, Brahms practiced a kind of analysis in reverse. Whereas analysts seek to reverse engineer composition to explanatory ends, Brahms composed music which realized an analytical understanding of his material. Murphy sees this particularly in the variations. I quote again, "Among the multiple rewards for listening to Brahms's variation sets is free access to the equivalent of a brilliant scholarly article analysing the theme, inscribed not in words but in tones." End quote. I will return to the Brahmsian half of Murphy's honorific shortly, but the analytical half compels a brief digression. It should not, I think, be necessary to justify the act of analysis as a prelude to performing it. But recent musical scholarship is defined in no small measure by a somewhat asymmetrically distributed anxiety about analysis, which means that, in a sense, all analysis comes today with a more or less explicit apologia, if not health warning, depending on your disciplinary perspective. For although analysts have had little to say about the practice of historical musicology, musicologists have had a great deal to say about analysis, much of it negative. And this is a turn of events that has provoked, I think, regular exasperation amongst analytical practitioners. As Giles Hooper complained back in 2004, quote, "Analytical practice is too often discussed only by those who are instinctively critical of it or insufficiently familiar with it," end quote. This discourse's driving impulse has been musicology's evident inability to position itself in a postmodern context except at analysis expense, a difficulty stemming from the equation of formalism and modernism. To maintain a commitment to close reading, so the argument goes, is to consort with formalism, thereby risking contamination with the evils of modernity, including outmoded notions of organicism, the whole philosophical and historical paraphernalia of Hegelianism, and hegemonic attitudes in Western culture, which have become the source of much post-colonial anxiety of late. All of which puts Brahms the analyst in a difficult position, or at least in one that is more fraught with disciplinary tension than Murphy suggests. That Brahms and his circle harboured organicist sympathies is no secret, as Nicole Grimes' recent study of the prehistory of Schoenbergian developing variation carefully documents. Grimes cites, amongst others, Hermann Deiters, who noted in his biography of 1880 that Brahms, quote, "felt the necessity of penetrating the organic structure of musical works," end quote, from the start of his career. Deiters went so far as to argue that the regard for pure musical form constituted Brahms's basic aesthetic principle. Yet, if Brahms's music is analytically tractable because it is analytically composed, then the charges levelled against analysis might as well be levelled at Brahms himself. Such melding of analytical and biographical compositional perspectives reveals a blind spot in the postmodern critique of analysis, which is the problem of what to do with music that was manifestly composed within the organicist aesthetic tradition. It seems clear that any attempt to dissociate Brahms from the aesthetic of autonomy is historically irresponsible in the sense that it calls, ironically in the name of historicism, for a mode of engagement that consigns autonomy to the historical dustbin. The honorifics Brahms the analyst, and perhaps in opposition, Brahms the postmodernist, seem radically incompatible, but squaring this circle is surely a central dilemma that the new musicology has bequeathed to Brahms scholarship. Which brings me then to part two, theories of romantic form. So what I intend to do today is produce a report, so to speak, on a theoretical project, but I need to take a bit of a run-up to that by introducing the theory on which it's based. So my goal today is to address this issue, at least for the analyst, by sketching what the romantic branch of the so-called New Formenlehre might say about one aspect of Brahms's sonata practice. A central question for theorists of romantic form has been how best to position it in relation to Viennese classicism. James Epikowski, Warren Darcy, Janet Schmalfeld, Stephen van der Mortele, Seth Monahan, Peter Smith, Andrew Davis, Benedict Taylor, and others have variously grappled with the fact that our orientating formal theories are derived overwhelmingly from the practices of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Van der Mortele has styled this problem as a tension between negative and positive approaches, the former aligning with the notion of deformation proposed by Hepikowski, the latter adapting William Kaplan's approach to classical form in a romantic context. And here then is how van der Mortele puts this. Simply put, a positive approach would strive to establish a series of types and norms for 19th century form based solely on what happens in 19th century music itself. A negative approach would measure 19th century form against a set of types and norms that are external to it. The former option would mean redoing Kaplan's taxonomic project in a new repertoire, while the latter is already built into Hepikowski and Darcy's theory of norms and deformations. End quote. Theorists in the orbit of Kaplan's theory have responded to this challenge in different ways. Janet Schmalfeld has, for example, stressed the importance of process as a romantic category. Romantic form's novelty, at least in the Beethovenian legacy, resides, in these terms, in its dialectical reconception of classical forms through which listeners are compelled to reinterpret formal functions in retrospect as new information transforms initial formal perceptions. My own work, and I have to come to that at some point, so it may as well be now, which operates in dialogue with Schmalfeld's idea, emphasizes syntactic change as the key to romantic formal innovation. So here, in a nutshell, is my attitude. Any address on a composer's large-scale formal strategies is attendant upon what I would call an empirical map of their local syntactic predilections. Brahms's departures from classical convention are primarily comprehensible in relation to his thematic syntactic protocols. A first theme recapitulation, for instance, begs to be understood in relation to that theme's expositional properties before we consider it in relation to classical paradigms. Since any sonata's strategic specificity is primarily a function of the network of material interactions which convey its formal process and resultant impression of if-then causal logic. A failure to relate deformational events to their syntactic context cannot be compensated by pointing to a classical comparator from which they deviate, because the deviation is not a processual characteristic of the movement. Right then, so to more practical things. My paper explores this idea by reporting on a corpus study of first theme syntax in 37 instrumental movements by Brahms, and here then is the corpus. It's all of those and all of those. Okay, so this amounts to his total sonata-type oeuvre with two omissions. First, the Academic Festival Overture, which I regard as a sort of potpourri overture that becomes a sonata in its later stages. And secondly, the Horn Trio, the first movement of which is not in sonata form. The study has three goals. First, to develop a thematic typology. Second, to enable empirically grounded assertions about Brahms's intra-thematic tactics. And third, to examine what I call pathway mapping in Brahms's music, by tracing the relationship between initiating and cadential functions within his themes. So the study's results are collated in handout 1, which contains a lot of tables which I'm going to demystify as we go on. And handout 2 will give the accompanying musical examples. Before I dive into those, I just want to clarify a few bits of terminology. And I'll do that with the following list. The first qualification is that I've loosened William Kaplan's prohibition on periods having similar medial and final cadences. There are structures in Brahms which look so much like periods, even though they have similar cadences medially and finally, that classifying them as something else seems rather perverse. So I've taken that as a starting point. Then I've also designated themes as periods rather than hybrids, even if their antecedents are organised as sentences. I'll show you some of these later on. But again, it seemed foolish to invent separate categories for these things. The third thing is, I designate main themes as A. That's useful information because it helps you to decipher the tables. And subsequent subsections within A using integer suffixes. What that means is that I describe a contrasting middle section, for example, as A2. And if it is a contrasting middle, I'll put CM after it, so you know what's going on. Okay, a short word about cadences, then. Cadence has to be distinguished from cadential in my practice. Cadences are cadential progressions, like PACs, HCs, IACs, and so forth. Cadential, as it says there, describes an end phrase containing one or more cadences. And just for the record, I've used evaded in that table to describe, in the tables, to describe cadential progressions, the completion of which either elides or is replaced with a return to its start. That's a terminology that sometimes elicits confusion. Then next, I've used that arrow to describe becoming. This is Janet Schmalfeld's terminology, and I've retained it. And finally, there is a subcategory of sentence which starts by looking like a period. I've called that a sentence with periodic presentation, which is van der Mortel's term, and I've housed that within the category of sentence more generally. Okay, so part 3. So here then is my report on this project, and then I will draw some conclusions from it. Table 1 attempts a typology of Brahms's first themes. You might notice that 2 of the concerti, that's opus 15 and 102, appear twice. The reason being that they have substantially different structures for ritornello 1 and solo 1. For opus 77 and opus 83, that's not really the case, although they have different contexts around them as well. Otherwise, I think the table provokes 5 general observations. First, in his entire oeuvre, Brahms employs only 5 stable types for a main theme, which are, as you see, periods, sentences, grand antecedents and dissolving consequence, hybrids, and compounds. And I've broken compounds down into 2 subcategories. 5A is small ternary themes, and 5B is rather unhelpfully called other, and I'll come back to other shortly. Okay, the others are really sui generis, and I'm going to give one example as we go along. The second point here is that Brahms does not favour straightforward classical conventions. In particular, simple periods and sentences are uncommon. None of the 4 periods and few of the 7 sentences, in fact, are classically unproblematic. Third, radical departures from classical convention, that is to say, themes that have no obvious anchorage in classical precedent, are also a minority. And even then, their novelty resides in the concatenation of functions rather than the functions themselves. Fourth, Brahms's overwhelming preference is for hybrid or compound themes. That's 20 out of the 39 examples. Fifth, some types have fairly even chronological distribution. For example, small ternary themes, which Brahms returned to across his career from opus 5 to opus 120, whilst others do not. Type 2, for instance, of which there are no examples at all before opus 77, or type 3, which Brahms neglected between 1858 and 1884. Given its centrality to classical sonata syntax and the developmental concept of theme associated with Beethoven, the relative dearth of simple sentences is especially notable. The fact that Brahms writes not a single sentential first theme before 1878 is striking, although, as I'll show, sentential designs do appear in other contexts. I'll come back to that. Moreover, although Table 2 catalogues 7 Type 2 entries, few of them simplistically resemble classical sentences. The closest we get is opus 90, which is shown in example 1. So I'm now going to sample the various types as we go along. Discounting the 2-measure anacrusis, which, as Carl Dahlhaus noted, supplies the theme's baseline and much else besides, and I've used a bracket to show how that works its way into the theme. Measures 3 to 15 display a pretty clear sentential scheme, rounded with an elided PAC. And here it is. So, statement. Response. Continuation. Fragmentation and cadence. And a PAC. On the other hand, consider example 2. which is the first theme of Opus 77. The division into presentation, continuation, and cadence is fairly clear, but both statement and response end cadentially, which lends measures 1 to 17 a periodic character, and this is what van der Mortele calls a sentence with periodic presentation. But note also that the medial and final cadences in that context are half cadential, which feature, according to Kaplan, would preclude periodic classification entirely. So now here then is example 2. So, statement. But ending with a half cadence. Response. Ending with a converging half cadence. Continuation. And an IAC to end off. And so on. Brahms's periods are similarly evasive. All 4 are essentially sentential. Both antecedents and consequents are sentences, meaning that Brahms never writes a periodic antecedent with a straightforward basic idea contrasting idea design. The most problematic is Opus 60, which is given in example 3. Measures 1 to 31 self-evidently divide in 2, given the recall of measure 1 in measure 11 after a cadence, that is a half cadence in fact, which posits measures 1 to 10 as an antecedent. After much phrase expansion, however, the consequent arrives at measure 27 on a half cadence as well. Recall Kaplan's injunction again. This issue might be circumvented by stretching the consequent cadence to include the decisive 5-1 progression in measures 31 to 2, turning measures 27 to 32, in other words, into a kind of covered PAC, although the attenuated dominant and implied E-6-3 chord in measures 28 to 30 surely strains the credibility of that reading. These expansion techniques merit closer attention. As the overlay in example 3 explains, we can, with some license, see both the antecedent and the consequent as a sentence prefaced by a thematic introduction. The consequent, however, expands every aspect of the antecedent. The 1-measure basic idea is doubled in size, so that the antecedent's 2-measure basic idea plus repetition mushrooms into a 4-measure statement and response. And the antecedent continuation plus cadence, which occupies 6 measures, inflates to 11 measures, thanks to the attempted half cadence in measure 21's failure to settle. We just go straight into a sequential progression. A third reading might fold measures 32 to 41 into the first theme as well, given that they comprise a variant of the antecedent, albeit one occurring entirely over a tonic pedal. At this point, however, we leave classical formal theory behind, and Opus 60 would transfer itself to category 5b. I'll play you that. So, antecedent, statement and response, continuation, and a half cadence. Consequent. Basic idea doubled in size. Response, also doubled in size. Continuation. Coming to a half cadence, which is overwritten. Sequential descend. Converging half cadence. Okay, is that the end of the theme? E-6-3. 5. 1. Transition, perhaps? Or is this still part of the main theme? Because the transition might also start here, there, and so on. Opus 60's theme is partly explicable as an intertextual gloss on Opus 1, which is shown in example 4. A connection amplified by Opus 60's distended Genesis, which stretches back to within 2 years of Opus 1. In its final state, Opus 60 depresses Opus 1's mode to C minor, but both begin their consequent on flat 7, reflecting a common origin, perhaps, in the first movement of Beethoven's Wallenstein Sonata, which, as I'm sure you know, has a statement response that moves from 1 to flat 7 as well. Both Opera 1 and 60 are moreover sentential periods in which the antecedent continuation is enlarged in the consequent. Opus 1's antecedent ends with a compressed continuation plus half cadence, the dominant of which is then prolonged over 2 measures. The consequent continuation adds 2 measures to this design, generating a dominant prolongation by upper and lower neighbour notes before the PAC prevails in measures 16 to 17. Statement, response, continuation and cadence, half cadence, extension, consequent, response, continuation, PAC, transition, and so on. Hybrid themes, this is type 4, and compound themes, type 5, are far more common. The Sonata Opus 2 affords an interesting early instance of hybridization, and that's example 5. This is almost a sentential period, except to say that there is no medial cadence. Instead, the antecedent continuation consists of a 6 measure standing on 5, and the consequent does possess a cadence, a Phrygian half cadence that is, which follows a continuation that single-mindedly focuses on the liquidation of the statement's second element. The syntax here plays 2 related games with convention. The antecedent standing on 5 is a formula more commonly associated with introductions, transitions, or retransitions, which means that the antecedent's presentational status is immediately challenged by a form-functional cuckoo in the nest, if you like, which upsets our perception that measures 1 to 2 initiate a theme and transfers that burden onto measure 9, where the dominant resolves. In turn, the consequent's half cadence seems more at home in an antecedent phrase. We might imagine a counterfactual scenario in which measures 9 to 15 are followed with a consequent closed with a PAC. And I'll play you this in its non-counterfactual form. Statement, response, standing on 5. No cadence. Consequent, maybe. Liquidation. Phrygian half cadence. There. Example 6 contrasts this with a hybrid form from the end of Brahms's career, which is the Clarinet Quintet, opus 115. And this offers one of the most striking examples of the expansion technique that I've elsewhere called proliferation, which is the tendency for intrathematic functions to sort of enlarge and enlarge inside themes. The theme is essentially a very large sentence, but Brahms incorporates multiple smaller structures within it. The relationship between the material of 1 to 2 and 6 to 9, that is the measures, for instance, implies a kind of statement-response design, albeit one in which differing conclusions are drawn from the same starting point at lower intrathematic levels. Measures 1 to 5 comprise an irregular compound basic idea in which both BI and CI are themselves miniature statement-response structures, as the example shows. The latter given a 1-measure extension, while the quartet pours over 3 to admit the clarinet's entry. Measures 6 to 9 eliminate the contrasting idea, but by way of compensation double the size of the basic idea, creating a statement response that stretches the basic idea over 2 measures. Brahms moves from this through a continuation at measure 14 to a cadential phrase in which the hoped-for PAC is once evaded and once deceived before resolving categorically to demarcate the transition. And here we are. Statement, response, but forming one half of a compound basic idea. But now, statement, response, continuation. Now the cadential section. Try again. And again. And finally, transition. More substantive evidence of proliferation is offered by Brahms's Type 5 themes. The small ternary themes, that's what I call 5a, fall clearly into two subcategories, classified in Table 2. You'll have to juggle the handouts at this point, I'm afraid. So there are complete ternary designs and incomplete designs in which the reprise dissolves into or becomes the transition. Although one instance, that's Opus 36, is expansive on an almost Brucknerian scale, for the most part the ternary themes are relatively compact. Perhaps the most compact is that of Opus 88, which is example 7. Here, A1 and A1 prime are periods, although the location of the reprise is blurred thanks to the technique of divisional overlap variously explored by Peter Smith and Clarissa Reddick. The tonal reprise begins unequivocally in the middle of measure 15 with the beat 3 arrival on F, but this coincides with the beginning of the contrasting idea, not the basic idea, an elaboration of which has been in progress since measure 14. And this variation is in turn emergent from the liquidatory process that characterises the contrasting middle's end, which, following a 4-measure statement-response design, jettisons the first half of the basic idea from measure 13. So here is that. So, antecedent, coming to a half cadence, sorry, IAC, reopened, consequent, PAC in 3, contrasting middle, initially over 6, but returning to 5. Now, there's the overlap, antecedent again, consequent, and the PAC. And off into the transition with a rather wonderful linkage technique to make that happen. More loosely organised in almost every way is the first theme of Opus 78, shown in example 8. So this has a dissolving reprise, as I'll show you. A1 is harmonically open-ended, consisting of a basic idea continuation cadence hybrid, which closes with a 5 PAC, evaded and reopened as what Schmalfeld has called a 19th century half cadence. That is, a half cadence with a dominant 7th. In keeping with all of Brahms' small ternary themes with a dissolving reprise, he selects a point in A1's design which might serve as a springboard for modulation when the reprise happens. In this case, using the A1 continuation as the basis of a sequential ascent, which begins at measure 23 and ends up with a 5 PAC for the medial caesura. That's not in the example. As in Opus 88, so here also there is a parametric non-congruence at the point of reprise. The violin's Hauptmotif at the end of measure 1 returns in measure 20 before the bass finds the tonic at the downbeat of measure 21. And the ambiguity of the Hauptmotif as anacrusis and as part of a tonic prolongation is exacerbated thereafter because the piano enters at the end of measure 21 in imitation, which means that temporarily it is unclear whether the A1 reprise begins with the violin or the piano. So here is that. Basic idea, continuation, then we head towards, we hope, a PAC in 5, try again, becomes a 19th century half cadence, reopened, and then here is A2, wonderfully in B major, returning for the A reprise, but where is the reprise, in fact? Is it here, now, or here. And on we go. The reprise dissolves. And so forth. Okay, you'll just miss the 5 PAC there. Opus 98, this is example 9, supplies a subtle but representative example of type 3 to complete my survey. Nearly. One more example. Hepikoski and Darcy define the grand antecedent as, quote, a lengthy, often multi-modular antecedent phrase, which is often sentential. They cite Mozart's last 2 symphonies, but Beethoven's 3rd and 7th are also relevant, I think. Opus 98's antecedent accordingly comprises an expansive sentence, which discloses initial ambiguity in the relationship between presentation and continuation. So there are 2 readings there. Reading 1 understands measures 1 to 4 as a statement and response, meaning that measure 5 constructs the continuation out of the basic idea, which then fragments in the following measures. Reading 2 posits measures 1 to 8 as a compound statement response. That is to say, a statement response and another statement response forming a larger statement and response, if that makes sense. It's all in the handout. The dissolving consequent then begins in elision with the antecedents covered PAC in measure 19, and of course, as I'm sure you know, that initiates a double canon as an elaboration of A1. And this departs from its model as we enter the transition at measure 27 in correspondence with measure 9. So statement, response. Is this the continuation here, or still part of this presentation? A reprise, but this dissolves into transition. Okay, so finally, before I move to my next and penultimate section, to look at one of the Type 5B themes. These fit into no obvious category. They're hybrids on a large scale. By way of example, please look at example 10, which is the main theme of the Tragic Overture, Opus 81. This comprises 2 successive functions. It starts with a period and then continues with a sentence. But ingeniously, Brahms uses the thematic introduction at the start as an element that's worked into the theme itself. So first of all, at the end of the opening period, Brahms opens up a space which incorporates the metric space of the thematic introduction into the opening period, and then he uses it again as the cadential formula at the end of the whole theme. So I'll talk you through that now. Thematic introduction. So, statement, response, continuation, coming to a 5 PAC, reopened, consequent phrase, continuation, PAC with the thematic introduction built in. Now we have a sentence, response, continuation, okay, we tried a cadence, now we try again, expanded, and that's the end of the thing. Okay, so that completes my survey of types. Before closing, I have a section which I've called Case Studies. This incorporates 2 questions I want to pose on the back of them, and then I'll draw some conclusions. In addition to this overarching typology, the corpus can also be mined for more specific data, allowing us to build up the starting point for what I would call a syntactic map of Brahms's sonata practice. Table 3, for instance, isolates initiating functions, that is, the ways in which Brahms begins his themes. Discounting the presence of introductions, there are 4 categories of initiating function, which is to say, a basic idea, statement response, compound basic ideas, CBI, or antecedents is the final category. These functions, it should be stressed, are independent of thematic type. An antecedent might form the first half of a simple period, or the statement of a sentence with a periodic presentation, or the A1 section of a small ternary, and so on and so on. In other words, Table 3 collates the lowest level intrathematic functions which begin all of the themes classified. It is immediately clear that Brahms overwhelmingly favours statement-response designs. 19 out of the 39 themes do this. A preference which moreover spans all of the thematic types, and if you're interested in the statistics, there they all are. Self-evidently, Brahms's sentences begin with statement-response forms, but what is striking is the extent to which this opening gambit infuses all other theme types. A basic feature of Brahms's first theme style is therefore the habit of migrating the initiating function that would commonly be associated with a sentence into other themes. Brahms, we might argue, marginalises the pure sentence because he's more interested in beginning other types with sentence-like functions. Other initiating functions are minority interests, and they're distributed rather evenly across the corpus. One obvious point is that none of Brahms's antecedents initiates a period. Rather, his periodic antecedents are always sentential, or else begin with some kind of local hybrid form. Another is that he is as likely to begin a theme with a basic idea and proceed straight to a continuation as he is to begin with a compound basic idea, and neither of these decisions is type-specific. In 2 cases, that's Opus 100 and 102, S1, the compound basic idea forms the basic idea of a larger sentential design, although in Opus 100, this initiates a grand antecedent. Looking at the other end of Brahms's themes, Table 4 contrastingly summarises his cadential usage. So that, you'll have to take my word for it, identifies 7th cadence types across the corpus, there are no more than that, specifying the work in which they occur, the thematic type and the context, and introducing nuance where necessary, what kind of half cadence, whether the cadence is elided, and so on. I've split the half cadences into 2 categories because some of them are simply closed off as half cadences, and some of them are reopened from previous cadential progressions. In 4 special cases, that's Opus 11, 15, R1, 83, and 102, the ritornello again, no cadence occurs at all, but I simply don't have the time to go into that, so that's a rather complex issue. In situations where a theme type discloses only one cadential function, a sentence for instance, I've described this as an end function to avoid the cumbersome and tautological cadential cadence. That doesn't really mean anything. Even at this stage, one point is clear, which is Brahms's overwhelming preference for half cadences. An impressive 40 of the 70 cadences identified are half cadences, overshadowing the more modest community of 22 PACs and completely eclipsing the IAC's deceptive, evaded and plagal cadences. Perhaps Murphy might consider adding Brahms the half cadential to his list of honorifics. More substantive points emerge when we correlate this data with the functional locations of the cadences, as Table 5 does. Reading from left to right in those gives you a sense of how many of each cadence inhabits a given function. Reading from top to bottom reveals the distribution of cadences across the functions. The antecedents are unproblematic, closing with HCs or IACs in both periodic and non-periodic contexts. But the consequence contrastingly expose again how problematic Brahms's periods are. There's only one type 1 theme that ends with a PAC, and that's Opus 1. And of the other 3, 1, Opus 26, contrasts half cadences in different keys, and 2, 34 and 60 have strong periodic rhetoric, but employ contrasting half cadences in the same key. One of the most problematic is example 11, which is the piano quintet. This is rather troublesome for various reasons. What you have there is the cadential progression. This could be a half cadence, and I've claimed that it's such, but the issue is that we have a long Neapolitan, which is around flat, which becomes F sharp. And then what Brahms does is he converts that into a progression through the augmented sixth, going, and that's all fine, except to say that we should have, of course, like so. But what Brahms does instead is he turns that cadential 6/4 into the initiating tonic of a cadential progression. The other problem is whether that's a half cadence or whether the tonic that comes after it is the eventual resolution. So I'll leave you to decide which one of those you prefer. Okay, the greater accumulation of consequent PACs in compound themes, that's 6 examples, reflects the simple fact that compounds are more numerous than periods. More significantly, Table 4 underscores the extent to which half cadences serve as end functions. Opera 2, 5, 26, 34, 60, 99, 108 and 102 number 1 all do this unequivocally. In Operas 100 and 120 number 2, the half cadence closes a grand antecedent. And in the small ternary themes with dissolving reprise, all except Opus 87 have half cadences as their only cadential event. Opus 51 is perhaps the most extreme case, given that its A1 tonic half cadence is contrasted with an A2 closing half cadence in B minor, if you can believe that, given the piece is in C minor. In all, 14 of the themes trade entirely in half cadential closure, contributing to a loosening effect which undermines the classical distinction noted by Kaplan between the tight-knit syntax of first themes and the looser organisation of second themes. Okay, finally then, Table 6 cross-references initiating and cadential functions with the aim of mapping the relationships in the data compiled in the tables 3 to 5. So what that does, essentially, is it collates all of the cadences ensuing from the initiating functions. And what I'm trying to show is the routes that Brahms follows from an initiating function through to a cadence, essentially, what they're likely to be. You can get from that every possible route that Brahms takes from however he wants to start a theme to however he wants to end it, and all the cadences in between. Oh, sorry, I was going to play you that. In the interest of time, maybe I'll not go over that. Because I've still got something to get through. So here we are. So you can distill. You want me to play it? Shall I play it? Yeah, Nicole wants to play it. Are you happy for me to do that? Yeah, good. Okay. Okay, here's example 11 then. No. Okay. So we have this region of G flat, which becomes F sharp, and here's the cadence. But does it resolve here? Is my question. Okay, right. So, back on track after that. Right, so, what this table does, this is my penultimate table, I promise you, for this part of the survey, is it tells you how many final cadences and of which type ensue from a given starting point. And you can glean various things from that. You might notice, for example, that if Brahms is going to start with the statement and response here, he's almost as likely to end with a PAC as to go through to an ending half cadence. But there is an obvious predominance of internal half cadences following antecedents, which means that he's twice as likely, pretty much, to go to a half cadence from an antecedent as he is to go from, for example, statement and response to a PAC, and so on and so forth. And you can start to build up this syntactic map of where Brahms starts and where he goes, as a kind of strategic decision-making, in other words. Yeah? What this means, it seems to me, is that if you choose to, you can cross-reference any starting point and any end point, and you can build up a map of the kind that Robert Yerdingen designs for his schema theory, where he says, what is the likelihood of starting with a Romanesca and proceeding to a Prina, for instance? That sort of thing. Well, we can do the same thing with formal functions with this data. Yeah? We can either do it in this way, by establishing starting points and termini, or why not do it for a single work as well, and build up a kind of strategic map of where you start and where you might end and what the decision-making is in between. Like so. That, for example, is a crude representation of how Opus 68 might look. Given a particular starting point, given an end cadence for first theme, where do we go next, and what is the decision-making process, in other words? So that's where I'm hoping to go with all of those reams of data, is to produce this strategic map of syntax, in other words, which can therefore align what you do analytically with strategy and what you do theoretically with syntax in the first instance. Okay, right, I'm nearly there. Before I reach my conclusions, I've got two questions I want to ask. And when I've asked them, I'll deal with some conclusions. The first has to do with developing variation. So Walter Frisch has argued that developing variation only really asserts itself with Opus 26. The works before this exhibiting a kind of transformational technique which is not developing variation proper. More generally, Adorno and Dahlhaus both saw in Brahms's music a condition in which the logic of thematic development overrides form-functional considerations. But what I want to ask is what all of this has to do with syntax. It seems to me that it's difficult to generalize about correlations between Brahms's syntactic and motivic developmental decisions. Addressing Frisch's point, the germination of developing variation with Opus 26 does not, I think, mark the emergence of a different thematic syntax in the early 1860s. By way of proof, Table 7, that's your last table, tracks the use of themes types chronologically across the corpus. There is no indication of any correlated change of syntactic priorities after 1861. If anything, between Opus 26 and Opus 51, at least, there is an increased preoccupation with more recursive designs, that is to say, periods, and especially small ternary themes. More general questions of the interaction of syntax and developing variation are no less evasive. Although the dissolution of functions is a common strategy, the idea that they respond to an overarching preoccupation with motivic process is hard to substantiate. Brahms seldom engages in the kind of initial processual dialectic that Dahlhaus and Schmalfeld observe in the Tempest Sonata by Beethoven, for example. Where becoming occurs, it generally serves the dissolution of a grand antecedent or ternary reprise, but seldom impinges on thematic function. We are not obliged to convert an introduction into a theme after the fact, for instance. There are some isolated cases of intrathematic becoming. We saw one in Opus 2, for example. But more often, Brahms is happy to allow the functional identity of his first themes to remain untransformed. In other words, I think that syntactic and developmental considerations are very often either antithetical or in parallel, but seldom impacting directly on each other. A second, perhaps more tractable question concerns what Ryan McClelland has called Brahms's principle of destabilized beginnings. McClelland sketches a taxonomy of instability for Brahms's first themes, understood as formal problems through which the music is subsequently to work. McClelland's destabilizing features are harmonic and rhythmic metric, and they are usually either embedded harmonic anomalies or else rhythmic metric elements which disturb the relationship between material and its context. It's worth situating McClelland's categories in relation to syntactic concerns, I think, and Opus 36 is my case in point. That's my final example, which is example 12. The destabilizing feature here that McClelland identifies is the intrusion of E-flat into A1's initiating function, shown in example 12. And I will play you that. No, it won't do it. Okay. Let me try with this. There we are. So, G major, but E-flat. Okay, this, in fact, the E-flat, is part of a hexatonic complex which overlays the first theme and which I've tried to sketch there. Counterbalancing it is a region of B major in the contrasting middle, which means that the symmetrical major thirds either side of G are misaligned with the form functional divisions. As you'll see, E-flat reappears in A1 prime, completing the symmetrical movement from the lower third to the upper third and back. But none of this questions the theme's form-functional stability. The small ternary design is schematic and tight-knit, thanks to the 20 measure standing on 5 that secures the final tonic. In this case, the unstable features, which McClelland shows, Brahms later retrieves and stabilizes, appear in parallel with the first theme's form-functional design, but do not influence it. So, my point from this is that any theory of instability for Brahms, I think, needs to include syntactic or form-functional instability. And we need to think about how that relates to the destabilizing features that McClelland identifies. Okay, so that rather marathon haul brings me all the way through my project and some of its implications. What I want to do now, finally, then, is find some conclusions. By way of closure, I want to return to the broader disciplinary issues broached at the start. The relationship between Brahms's implication in the aesthetic of organicism and analytical practice is complex, and I think it is quite wrong to presume the inevitable synonymy of the two and found a critique upon it. The search for coherence in Brahms is legitimate and entirely consonant with any historical research, which wants to build an analytical method on the foundations of Brahms's aesthetic. But analysis is not a subset of organicism. It is not only that the scope of analytical practice today expands vastly beyond the search for coherence, unity, or the like. It is also that analytical strategies having little to do with organicism can nevertheless be fruitful for the analysis of Brahms. The project on which I've reported today is a case in point. It doesn't speak to the music's coherence, except in the trivial sense of obviating that it has a syntax, a feature that relates it to all tonal music, irrespective of aesthetic context. It doesn't repudiate coherence either. We might well go on to embed Brahms's thematic syntax in analytical narratives which demonstrate a connective logic or strategy for which coherence is central. The project's primary aim is taxonomy, and in this respect, its guiding star is empiricism, not organicism. But it may ultimately allow us to make precise assertions about the relationship between syntax and formal strategy, in which case issues of coherence become freshly relevant. 2 paragraphs to go. In 2004, Kofi Agawu defined the post-new musicological environment in terms of an encompassing pluralism. Agawu noted wryly that this put the new musicologists in a difficult position, so he thought, because it meant that they were obliged to accept the persistence of analysis under the terms of precisely the postmodern agenda that they had used to attack it. Today, this condition becomes ever more complex as music analysis' burgeoning pluralism coexists with a musicological diversity which happily navigates the entire spectrum of music's historical, political, cultural, sexual, economic, carnal, aesthetic, and psychological intersections, and more besides. But in the midst of all this, I would like to mount a plea for the continuing ontological relevance of score-based evidence as a facet of scholarship about Western art music, and for analysis as the principal means by which this evidence is accessed and decoded. Music in the Western art musical traditions is, for better or worse, literate, and literacy is not, as some have recently claimed, simply a medium of dissemination or a kind of textual enabler to performance. To the contrary, literacy is so fundamental to the production of music and its conceptual mechanisms in the Western traditions that to marginalise it is to render it render an essential facet of its being invisible to research. It is for this reason, amongst many others, that Brahms remains central to any debate about analysis. His music apostrophises the relationship between literate composition, analysis, and aesthetics with special clarity. At the same time, Brahms's encounter with the new form and lyre makes plain the extent to which fresh theoretical agendas can revivify well-trodden analytical paths. As an object of analysis, Brahms' music may well appear to be an old story or a done deal. But for the theory of romantic form, it is a new frontier, a territory which analysis is only beginning to explore. Thank you very much.